Chapter 13. The High King in Command. Now, said Peter as they finished their meal, Aslan and the girls, that's Queen Susan and Queen Lucy Caspian, are somewhere close. We don't know when he will act. In his time, no doubt, not ours. In the meantime, he would like us to do what we can on our own. You say, Caspian, we are not strong enough to meet Miraz in pitched battle. I'm afraid not, High King, said Caspian. He was liking Peter very much, but he was rather tongue-tied. It was much stranger for him to meet the great kings out of the old stories than it was for them to meet him. Very well, then, said Peter. I'll send him a challenge to a single combat. No one had thought of this before. Please, said Caspian, could it not be me? I want to avenge my father. You're wounded, said Peter. And anyway, wouldn't he just laugh at a challenge from you? I mean, we have seen that you are a king and a warrior, but he thinks of you as a kid. But sire, said the badger, who sat very close to Peter and never took his eyes off him, will he accept a challenge even from you? He knows he has the stronger army. Very likely he won't, said Peter. But there's always a chance. And even if he doesn't, we shall spend the best part of the day sending heralds to and fro and all that. By then, Aslan may have done something, and at least I can inspect the army and strengthen the position. I will send the challenge. In fact, I will write it at once. Have you pen and ink, Master Doctor? A scholar is never without them, Your Majesty, answered Dr. Cornelius. Very well, I will dictate, said Peter, and while the doctor spread out a parchment and opened his inkhorn and sharpened his pen, Peter leant back with half-closed eyes and recalled to his mind the language in which he had written such things long ago in Narnia's golden age. Right, he said at last. And now, if you're ready, Doctor. Dr. Cornelius dipped his pen and waited. Peter dictated as follows. Peter, by the gift of Aslan, by election, by prescription, and by conquest, High King over all kings in Narnia, Emperor of the Lone Islands and Lord of Cair Paravel, Knight of the most noble order of the Lion, to Miraz, son of Caspian the Eighth, sometime Lord Protector of Narnia, and now styling himself King of Narnia, greeting. Have you got that? Narnia, greeting, muttered the doctor. Yes, sire. Then begin a new paragraph, said Peter. For to prevent the effusion of blood, and for the avoiding of all other inconveniences likely to grow from the wars now levied in our realm of Narnia, it is our pleasure to adventure our royal person on behalf of our trusty and well-beloved Caspian in clean wager of battle, to prove upon your lordship's body that the said Caspian is lawful king under us in Narnia, both by our gift and by the laws of the Telmarines, and your lordship twice guilty of treachery, both in withholding the dominion of Narnia from the said Caspian, and in the most abominable, don't forget to spell with an H, Doctor, bloody and unnatural murder of your kindly lord and brother King Caspian, ninth of that name. Wherefore we most heartily provoke, challenge, and defy your lordship to the said combat and monarchy, and have sent these letters by the hand of our well-beloved and royal brother Edmund, sometime king under us in Narnia, Duke of Lantern Waste, and Count of the Western March, Knight of the noble order of the Table, to whom we have given full power of determining with your lordship all the conditions of the said battle, given at our lodging in Aslan's house this 12th day of the month, green roof, in the first year of Caspian 10th of Narnia. That ought to do, said Peter, drawing a deep breath. And now we must send 2 others with King Edmund. I think the giant ought to be one. He's not very clever, you know, said Caspian. Of course not, said Peter. But any giant looks impressive, if only he will keep quiet, and it will cheer him up. But who for the other? Upon my word, said Trumpkin, if you want someone who can kill with looks, Reepicheep would be the best. He would indeed, from all I hear, said Peter with a laugh. If only he wasn't so small. They wouldn't even see him till he was close. Send Glynstorm, sire, said Truffle Hunter. No one ever laughed at a centaur. An hour later, 2 great lords in the army of Miraz, the Lord Glosel and Lord Sopespian, strolling along their lines and picking their teeth after breakfast, looked up and saw coming down to them from the wood the centaur and the giant Wimblewether, whom they had seen before in battle, and between them a figure they could not recognize. Nor indeed would the other boys at Edmund's school have recognized him if they could have seen him at that moment, for Aslan had breathed on him at their meeting, and a kind of greatness hung about him. What's to do? Said the Lord Glosel. An attack? A parley, rather, said Sopespian. See, they carry green branches. They are coming to surrender, most likely. He that is walking between the centaur and the giant has no look of surrender in his face, said Glosel. Who can he be? It is not the boy Caspian. No, indeed, said Sopespian. This is a fell warrior. I warrant you, wherever the rebels have got him from, he is, in your lordship's private ear, a kinglier man than ever Miraz was. And what mail he wears! None of our smiths can make like that. I'll wager my dappled Pommery he brings a challenge, not a surrender, said Glosel. How then? Said Sopespian. We hold the enemy in our fist here. Miraz would never be so harebrained as to throw away his advantage on a combat. He might be brought to it, said Glosel in a much lower voice. Softly, said Sopespian. Step a little aside here, out of earshot of those sentries. Now, have I taken your lordship's meaning aright? If the king undertook wager of battle, whispered Glosel, why, either he would kill or be killed. So, said Sopespian, nodding his head. And if he killed, we should have won this war. Certainly, and if not? Why, if not, we should be as able to win it without the king's grace as with him. For I need not tell your lordship that Miraz is no very great captain, and after that we should be both victorious and kingless. And it is your meaning, my lord, that you and I could hold this land quite as conveniently without a king as with one? Glosel's face grew ugly. Not forgetting, said he, that it was we who first put him on the throne. And in all the years that he has enjoyed it, what fruits have come our way? What gratitude has he shown us? Say no more, answered Sopespian. But look, here comes one to fetch us to the king's tent. When they reached Miraz's tent, they saw Edmund and his 2 companions seated outside it and being entertained with cakes and wine, having already delivered the challenge and withdrawn while the king was considering it. When they saw them thus at close quarters, the two Telmarine lords thought all three of them very alarming. Inside, they found Miraz, unarmed and finishing his breakfast. His face was flushed, and there was a scowl on his brow. "There," he growled, flinging the parchment across the table to them. "See what a pack of nursery tales our jackanapes of a nephew has sent us." "By your leave, sire," said Glozell, "if the young warrior whom we have just seen outside is the King Edmund mentioned in the writing, then I would not call him a nursery tale, but a very dangerous knight." "King Edmund, pah," said Miraz. "Does your lordship believe in those old wives' fables about Peter and Edmund and the rest?" "I believe my eyes, your majesty," said Glozell. "Well, this is to no purpose," said Miraz. "But as touching the challenge, I suppose there is only one opinion between us?" "I suppose so, indeed, sire," said Glozell. "And what is that?" asked the king. "Most infallibly to refuse it," said Glozell. "Although I have never been called a coward, I must plainly say that to meet that young man in battle is more than my heart would serve for me. And if, as is likely, his brother, the High King, is more dangerous than he, why, on your life, my Lord King, have nothing to do with him." "Plague on you," cried Miraz. "It was not that sort of counsel I wanted. Do you think I am asking you if I should be afraid to meet this Peter, if there is such a man? Do you think I fear him? I wanted your counsel of the policy of the matter, whether we, having the advantage, should hazard it on a wager of battle." "To which I can only answer, your majesty," said Glozell, "that for all reasons the challenge should be refused. There is death in the strange knight's face." "There you are again," said Miraz, now thoroughly angered. "Are you trying to make it appear that I am as great a coward as your lordship?" "Your majesty may say your pleasure," said Glozell sulkily. "You talk like an old woman, Glozell," said the king. "What say you, my lord Caspian?" "Do not touch it, sire," was the reply. "And what your majesty says of the policy of the thing comes in very happily. It gives your majesty excellent grounds for refusal without any cause for questioning your majesty's honor or courage." "Great heaven!" exclaimed Miraz, jumping to his feet. "Are you also bewitched today? Do you think I am looking for grounds to refuse it? You might as well call me coward to my face." The conversation was going exactly as the two lords wished, so they said nothing. "I see what it is," said Miraz, after staring at them as if his eyes would start out of his head. "You are as lily-livered as hares yourselves, and have the effrontery to imagine my heart after the likeness of yours. Grounds for refusal, indeed! Excuses for not fighting! Are you soldiers? Are you Telmarines? Are you men? And if I do refuse it, as all good reasons of captaincy and martial policy urge me to do, you will think and teach others to think I was afraid. Is it not so?" "No man of your majesty's age," said Glozell, "would be called coward by any wise soldier for refusing the combat with a great warrior in the flower of his youth." "So I'm to be a dotard with one foot in the grave as well as a dastard," roared Miraz. "I'll tell you what it is, my lords. with your womanish counsels, ever shying from the 2 points, which is one of policy. You have done the very opposite of your intent. I had meant to refuse it, but I'll accept it. Do you hear? Accept it. I'll not be shamed because some witchcraft or treason has frozen both your bloods. We beseech your majesty, said Glozell. But Moraz had flung out of the tent, and they could hear him bawling out his acceptance to Edmund. The two lords looked at one another and chuckled quietly. I know he'd do it if he were properly chafed, said Glozell, but I'll not forget he called me a coward. It shall be paid for. There was a great stirring at Aslan's house when the news came back and was communicated to the various creatures. Edmund, with one of Moraz's captains, had already marked up the place for the combat, and ropes and stakes had been put round it. 2 Telmarines were to stand at 2 of the corners, and 1 in the middle of one side, as marshals of the lists. 3 marshals for the other 2 corners, and the other side were to be furnished by the High King. Peter was just explaining to Caspian that he could not be one, because his right to the throne was what they were fighting about, when suddenly a thick, sleepy voice said, Your Majesty, please. Peter turned, and there stood the eldest of the bulgy bears. If you please, Your Majesty, he said. I'm a bear, I am. To be sure you are, and a good bear too, I don't doubt, said Peter. Yes, said the bear, but it was always a right of the bears to supply 1 marshal of the lists. Don't let him, whispered Trumpkin to Peter. He's a good creature, but he'll shame us all. He'll go to sleep, and he will suck his paws, in front of the enemy, too. I can't help that, said Peter, because he's quite right. The bears had that privilege. I can't imagine how it has been remembered all these years, when so many other things have been forgotten. Please, Your Majesty, said the bear. It is your right, said Peter, and you shall be one of the marshals, but you must remember not to suck your paws. Of course not, said the bear in a very shocked voice. Why, you're doing it this minute, bellowed Trumpkin. The bear whipped his paw out of his mouth and pretended he hadn't heard. Sire, came a shrill voice from near the ground. Ah, Reepicheep, said Peter, after looking up and down and round as people usually did when addressed by the mouse. Sire, said Reepicheep, my life is ever at your command, but my honor is my own. Sire, I have among my people the only trumpeter in your Majesty's army. I had thought perhaps we might have been sent with the challenge. Sire, my people are grieved. Perhaps if it were your pleasure that I should be a marshal of the list, it would content them. A noise not unlike thunder broke out from somewhere overhead at this point, as giant Wimbleweather burst into one of those not very intelligent laughs to which the nicer sorts of giants are so liable. He checked himself at once and looked as grave as a turnip by the time Reepicheep discovered where the noise came from. I am afraid it would not do, said Peter very gravely. Some humans are afraid of mice. I had observed it, sire, said Reepicheep. And it would not be quite fair to Moraz, Peter continued, to have in sight anything that might abate the edge of his courage. Your Majesty is the mirror of honor, said the mouse, with one of his admirable bows. And on this matter, we have but a single mind. I thought I heard someone laughing just now.
If anyone present wishes to make me the subject of his wit, I am very much at his service, with my sword, whenever he has leisure.
An awful silence followed this remark, which was broken by Peter saying, Giant Wimbleweather and the bear and the centaur Glynstorm shall be our marshals. The combat will be at 2 hours after noon. Dinner at noon, precisely.
I say,
said Edmund as they walked away.
I suppose it is all right. I mean, I suppose you can beat him.
That's what I'm fighting him to find out, said Peter. Chapter 14. How all were very busy. A little before 2 o'clock, Trumpkin and the Badger sat with the rest of the creatures at the wood's edge, looking across at the gleaming line of Miraz's army, which was about 2 arrow shots away. In between, a square space of level grass had been staked for the combat. At the 2 far corners stood Glozell and Caspian with drawn swords. At the near corners were giant Wimbleweather and the bulgy bear, who, in spite of all their warnings, was sucking his paws and looking, to tell the truth, uncommonly silly. To make up for this, Glynstorm, on the right of the lists, stock still except when he stamped a hind hoof occasionally on the turf, looked much more imposing than the Telmarine Baron who faced him on the left. Peter had just shaken hands with Edmund and the doctor, and was now walking down to the combat. It was like the moment before the pistol goes at an important race, but very much worse.
I wish Aslan had turned up before it came to this, said Trumpkin. So do I, said Trufflehunter. But look behind you. Crows and crockery, muttered the dwarf as soon as he had done so. What are they? Huge people, beautiful people, like gods and goddesses and giants. Hundreds and thousands of them closing in behind us. What are they? It's the Dryads and the Hamadryads and Sylvans, said Trufflehunter. Aslan has awakened them. Humph, said the dwarf. That'll be very useful if the enemy try any treachery. But it won't help the High King very much if Miraz proves handier with his sword.
The Badger said nothing, for now Peter and Miraz were entering the lists from opposite ends, both on foot, both in chain shirts, with helmets and shields. They advanced till they were close together. Both bowed and seemed to speak, but it was impossible to hear what they said. Next moment the 2 swords flashed in the sunlight. For a second the clash could be heard, but it was immediately drowned because both armies began shouting like crowds at a football match.
Well done, Peter! Well done!
Shouted Edmund when he saw Miraz reel back a whole pace and a half.
Follow it up quick!
And Peter did, and for a few seconds it looked as if the fight might be won. But then Miraz pulled himself together, began to make real use of his height and weight.
Miraz! Miraz! The king! The king!
Came the roar of the Telmarines. Caspian and Edmund grew white with sickening anxiety.
Peter's taking some dreadful knocks, said Edmund.
Hello, said Caspian. What's happening now?
Both falling apart, said
Edmund.
A bit blown, I expect. Watch. Ah, now they're beginning again. More scientifically this time. Circling round and round, feeling each other's defenses.
I'm afraid this Miraz knows his work, muttered the doctor. But hardly had he said this when there was such a clapping and baying and throwing up of hoods among the old Narnians that it was nearly deafening.
What was it? What was it?
Asked the doctor.
My old eyes missed it.
The High King has picked him in the armpit, said Caspian, still clapping, just where the armhole of the hauberk let the point through. First blood.
It's looking ugly again now, though, said Edmund. Peter's not using his shield properly. He must be hurt in the left arm.
It was only too true. Everyone could see that Peter's shield hung limp. The shouting of the Telmarines redoubled.
You've seen more battles than I, said Caspian. Is there any chance now? Precious little, said Edmund. I suppose he might just do it, with luck.
Oh, why did we let it happen at all? Said Caspian. Suddenly, all the shouting on both sides died down. Edmund was puzzled for a moment. Then he said,
Oh, I see. They've both agreed to arrest. Come on, Doctor. You and I may be able to do something for the High King.
They ran down to the lists, and Peter came outside the ropes to meet them, his face red and sweaty, his chest heaving.
Is your left arm wounded?
Asked Edmund.
It's not exactly a wound,
Peter said.
I got the full weight of his shoulder on my shield, like a load of bricks, and the rim of the shield drove into my wrist. I don't think it's broken, but it might be a sprain. If you could tie it up very tight, I think I could manage.
While they were doing this, Edmund asked anxiously,
What do you think of him, Peter?
Tough, said Peter. Very tough. I have a chance if I can keep him on the hop till his weight and short wind come against him. In this hot sun, too. To tell the truth, I haven't much chance else. Give my love to everyone at home, Ed, if he gets me. Here he comes into the lists again. So long, old chap. Goodbye, Doctor. And I say, Ed, say something specially nice to Trumpkin. He's been a brick. Edmund couldn't speak. He walked back with the doctor to his own lines with a sick feeling in his stomach. But the new bout went well. Peter now seemed to be able to make some use of his shield, and he certainly made good use of his feet. He was almost playing Tig with Miraz now, keeping out of range, shifting his ground, making the enemy work.
Coward!
Booed the Telmarines.
Why don't you stand up to him? Don't you like it, eh? Thought you'd come to fight, not dance. Yeah!
Oh, I do hope he won't listen to them, said Caspian.
Not he,
said Edmund.
You don't know him. Oh!
For Miraz had gotten a blow at last on Peter's helmet. Peter staggered, slipped sideways, and fell on one knee. The roar of the Telmarines rose like the noise of the sea.
Now, Miraz, they yelled. Now, quick, quick, kill him!
But indeed, there was no need to egg the usurper on. He was on top of Peter already. Edmund bit his lips till the blood came. As the sword flashed down on Peter, it looked as if it would slash off his head. Thank heavens, it had glanced down his right shoulder. The dwarf-wrought mail was sound and did not break.
Great Scott, cried Edmund. He's up again, Peter. Go it, Peter! I couldn't see what happened, said the doctor. How did he do it?
Grabbed Miraz's arm as it came down, said Trumpkin, dancing with delight. There's a man for you. Uses his enemy's arm as a ladder. The High King! The High King! Up, old Narnia!
Look, said Truffle Hunter. Miraz is angry. It is good.
They were certainly at it hammer and tongs now. Such a flurry of blows that it seemed impossible for either not to be killed. As the excitement grew, the shouting almost died away. The spectators were holding their breath. It was most horrible and most magnificent. A great shout arose from the old Narnians. Miraz was down, not struck by Peter, but face downwards, having tripped on a tussock. Peter stepped back, waiting for him to rise.
Oh, bother, 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 said Edmund to himself. Need he be as gentlemanly as all that? I suppose he must. Comes of being a knight and a high king. I suppose it is what Aslan would like. But that brute will be up again in a minute, and then. But that brute never rose. The lords Glazelle and Sir Caspian had their own plans already. As soon as they saw their king down, they leapt into the lists, crying, "Treachery! Treachery! An Arnian traitor stabbed him in the back while he lay helpless. To arms! To arms, Telmar!" Peter hardly understood what was happening. He saw two big men running towards him with drawn swords. Then the third Telmarine had leapt over the ropes on his left. "To arms, Narnia! Treachery!" Peter shouted. If all three had set upon him at once, he would never have spoken again. But Glozell stopped to stab his own king dead where he lay. "That's for your insult this morning," he whispered as the blade went home. Peter swung to face Sir Caspian, slashed his legs from under him, and, with the back cut of the same stroke, walloped off his head. Edmund was now at his side, crying, "Narnia! Narnia! The lion!" The whole Telmarine army was rushing towards them, but now the giant was stamping forward, stooping low and swinging his club. The centaurs charged, twang, twang, behind, and hiss, hiss, overhead came the archery of dwarfs. Trumpkin was fighting at his left. Full battle was joined. "Come back, Reepicheep, you little ass!" shouted Peter. "You'll only be killed. This is no place for mice." But the ridiculous little creatures were dancing in and out among the feet of both armies, jabbing with their swords. Many a Telmarine warrior that day felt his foot suddenly pierced as if by a dozen skewers, hopped on one leg, cursing the pain, and fell as often as not. If he fell, the mice finished him off. If he did not, someone else did. But almost before the old Narnians were really warmed to their work, they found the enemy giving way. Tough-looking warriors turned white, gazed in terror, not on the old Narnians, but on something behind them, and then flung down their weapons, shrieking, "The wood! The wood! The end of the world!" But soon neither their cries nor the sound of weapons could be heard any more, for both were drowned in the ocean-like roar of the awakened trees as they plunged through the ranks of Peter's army and then on in pursuit of the Telmarines. Have you ever stood at the edge of a great wood on a high ridge when a wild southwester broke over it in full fury on an autumn evening? Imagine that sound. And then imagine that the wood, instead of being fixed to one place, was rushing at you, and was no longer trees, but huge people, yet still like trees because their long arms waved like branches, and their heads tossed, and leaves fell round them in showers. It was like that for the Telmarines. It was a little alarming even for the Narnians. In a few minutes, all Miraz's followers were running down to the great river in the hope of crossing the bridge to the town of Baruna, and there defending themselves behind ramparts and closed gates. They reached the river, but there was no bridge. It had disappeared since yesterday. Then utter panic and horror fell upon them, and they all surrendered. But what had happened to the bridge? Early that morning, after a few hours' sleep, the girls had woken to see Aslan standing over them and to hear his voice saying, "We will make holiday." They rubbed their eyes and looked round them. The trees had all gone, but could still be seen moving away towards Aslan's house in a dark mass. Bacchus and Maenads, his fierce madcap girls, and Silenus were still with them. Lucy,
fully rested, jumped up. Everyone was awake. Everyone was laughing. Flutes were playing, cymbals clashing. Animals, not talking animals, were crowding in upon them from every direction. "What is it, Aslan?" said Lucy, her eyes dancing and her feet wanting to dance.
"Come, children," said he, "ride on my back again today."
"Oh, lovely!" cried Lucy, and both girls climbed on to the warm golden back, as they had done no one knew how many years before. Then the whole party moved off, Aslan leading, Bacchus and his Maenads leaping, rushing, and turning somersaults, the beasts frisking round them, and Silenus and his donkey bringing up the rear. They turned a little to the right, raced down a steep hill, and found the long bridge of Beruna in front of them. Before they had begun to cross it, however, up out of the water came a great wet bearded head, larger than a man's, crowned with rushes. It looked at Aslan, and out of its mouth a deep voice came.
"Hail, Lord,"
It said.
"loose my chain."
"Who on earth is that?" whispered Susan. "I think it's the river god, but hush," said Lucy.
"Bacchus,"
said Aslan.
"deliver him from his chains."
"That means the bridge, I expect," thought Lucy. And so it did. Bacchus and his people splashed forward into the shallow water, and a minute later the most curious things began happening. Great strong trunks of ivy came curling up all the piers of the bridge, growing as quickly as a fire grows, wrapping the stones round, splitting, breaking, separating them. The walls of the bridge turned into hedges gay with hawthorn for a moment, and then disappeared as the whole thing, with a rush and a rumble, collapsed into the swirling water. With much splashing, screaming, and laughter, the revelers waded or swam or danced across the ford. "Hooray! It's the ford of Beruna again now," cried the girls, and up the banks on the far side and into the town. Everyone in the streets fled before their faces. The first house they came to was a school, a girls' school, where a lot of Narnian girls, with their hair done very tight and ugly tight collars round their necks and thick, tickly stockings on their legs, were having a history lesson. The sort of history that was taught in Narnia under Moraz's rule was duller than the truest history you ever read, and less true than the most exciting adventure story. "If you don't attend, Gwendolen," said the mistress, "and stop looking out of the window, I shall have to give you an order mark." "But please, Miss Prizzle," began Gwendolen. "Did you hear what I said, Gwendolen?" asked Miss Prizzle. "But please, Miss Prizzle," said Gwendolen, "there's a lion." "Take 2 order marks for talking nonsense," said Miss Prizzle. "And now—" A roar interrupted her. Ivy came curling in at the windows of the classroom. The walls became a mass of shimmering green, and leafy branches arched overhead where the ceiling had been. Miss Prizzle found she was standing on grass in a forest glade. She clutched at her desk to steady herself, and found that the desk was a rose bush. Wild people such as she had never even imagined were crowding round her. Then she saw the lion, screamed and fled, and with her fled the class, who were mostly dumpy, prim little girls with fat legs. Gwendolen hesitated.
"You'll stay with us, sweetheart?"
said Aslan. "Oh, may I? Thank you," said Gwendolen. Instantly she joined hands with 2 of the Maenads, who whirled her round in a merry dance and helped her take off some of the unnecessary and uncomfortable clothes that she was wearing. Wherever they went in the little town of Beruna, it was the same. Most of the people fled. A few joined them. When they left the town, they were a larger and a merrier company. They swept on across the level fields on the north bank or left bank of the river. At every farm, animals came out to join them. Sad old donkeys who had never known joy grew suddenly young again. Chained dogs broke their chains. Horses kicked their carts to pieces and came trotting along with them, clop, clop, kicking up the mud and whinnying. At a well in a yard, they met a man who was beating a boy. The stick burst into flour in the man's hand. He tried to drop it, but it stuck to his hand. His arm became a branch, his body the trunk of a tree. His feet took root. The boy, who had been crying a moment before, burst out laughing and joined them. At a little town halfway to Beaver's Dam, where two rivers met, they came to another school, where a tired-looking girl was teaching arithmetic to a number of boys who looked very like pigs. She looked out of the window and saw the divine revelers singing up the street, and a stab of joy went through her heart. Aslan stopped right under the window and looked up at her. "Oh, don't, don't," she said. "I love to, but I mustn't. I must stick to my work, and the children would be frightened if they saw you." "Frightened?" said the most pig-like of the boys. "Who's she talking to out of the window? Let's tell the inspector she talks to people out of the window when she ought to be teaching us." "Let's go and see who it is," said another boy, and they all came crowding to the window. But as soon as their mean little faces looked out, Bacchus gave a great cry of "Eon! Eoi, oi, oi, oi!" and the boys all began howling with fright and trampling one another down to get out of the door and jumping out of the windows. And it was said afterwards, whether truly or not, that those particular little boys were never seen again, but that there were a lot of very fine little pigs in that part of the country which had never been there before. "Now, dear hearts," said Aslan to the mistress, and she jumped down and joined them. At Beaver's Dam they recrossed the river and came east again along the southern bank. They came to a little cottage where a child stood in the doorway crying. "Why are you crying, my love?" asked Aslan. The child, who had never seen a picture of a lion, was not afraid of him. "Auntie's very ill," she said. "She's going to die." Then Aslan went to go in at the door of the cottage, but it was too small for him. So when he had got his head through, he pushed with his shoulders. Lucy and Susan fell off when he did this, and lifted the whole house up, and it fell backwards and apart. And there, still in her bed, though the bed was now in the open air, lay a little old woman who looked as if she had dwarf blood in her. She was at death's door, but when she opened her eyes and saw the bright hairy head of the lion staring into her face, she did not scream or faint. She said, "Oh, Aslan, I knew it was true. I've been waiting for this all my life. Have you come to take me away?" "Yes, dearest," said Aslan, "but not the long journey yet." And as he spoke, like the flush creeping along the underside of a cloud at sunrise, the color came back to her white face, and her eyes grew bright, and she sat up and said, "Why, I do declare I feel that better. I think I could take a little breakfast this morning." "Here you are, mother," said Bacchus, dipping a pitcher in the cottage well and handing it to her. But what was in it now was not water, but the richest wine, red as red currant jelly, smooth as oil, strong as beef, warming as tea, cool as dew. "Eh, you've done something to our well," said the old woman. That makes a nice change, that does. And she jumped out of bed.
Ride on me,
Said Aslan, and added to Susan and Lucy.
You two queens will have to run now.
But we'd like that just as well, said Susan, and off they went again. And so, at last, with leaping and dancing and singing, with music and laughter, and roaring and barking and neighing, they all came to the place where Moraz's army stood, flinging down their swords and holding up their hands. And Peter's army, still holding their weapons and breathing hard, stood round them with stern and glad faces. And the first thing that happened was that the old woman slipped off Aslan's back and ran across to Caspian, and they embraced one another, for she was his old nurse.